Gary Dale was born in 1938 at the Toronto Western Hospital. His life was not a sob story, where his parents were barely being able to take care of him because of how poor they were, which ultimately led to Gary growing up in an orphanage that could barely pay their bills, where all poor Gary was fed was stale bread and moldy water. No, it was nothing like that. Gary's life was the one of a typical boy who was born and raised in Toronto, Canada. He was raised in a middle-class environment surrounded by good influences. Not only did he not have to worry about where he would sleep each night, but he also had plenty of food and drink in the form of milk and cheese, with his father being a milk delivery man and all.
My dad was involved with milk delivery. He was a milkman for part of his life, and he had a horse and a wagon that he delivered milk with. And then he ended up being a supervisor and still with the Borden Milk Company.
He was educated well at his first school, which happened to be across the street from his house. This made it fairly easy for Gary to be constantly playing with his friends, whether it was playing hockey in the boiling hot sun or making up a random game that involved the snow that surrounded them. Maybe he never had to stand up to a bully or wave goodbye to his father as he went off to war, but his life was interesting nonetheless. In fact, it's interesting enough that I'd like to share with you the day in the life of Gary Dale. Gary awoke to the warm smell of breakfast. Every inch of his nostrils was satisfied with the thought of pancakes being cooked to perfection in the room below his. It was a weekend, and of course, Gary being the average 12-year-old boy, he quickly pushed every thought of sleeping in out of his mind and rushed down the stairs to be greeted with the delicious pancake breakfast. "Well, somebody's in a hurry," said Gary's mom, Kathleen, as Gary came flying into the kitchen. "It's a weekend," replied Gary. "I've got things to do and people to see." "I'm sure you do," said Gary's dad, Stan, with a chuckle as he came down the stairs. He was followed by Gary's younger brother, Warren, who was still rubbing the sleep out of his eyes. "Me, Gary, and Keith are doing all sorts of fun stuff today," said Warren, as him, Gary, and Stan sat at the table. Kathleen quickly set the table and delivered 2 pancakes to each son and husband, plus herself. Everyone was ready to dig in. "Hey, where's Keith?" called out Kathleen. "Yeah, if he's going to come with Warren and I, he's got to have breakfast," said Gary. "Keith, get down here. Your breakfast is getting cold," called Stan. Several minutes later, Keith, the oldest of the 3 brothers, came lumbering down the stairs. Kathleen pulled out a chair for him, and he sat. "Good to see you, sleepyhead," said Kathleen in a bright morning tone. "Thanks, Mum," said Keith as his eyes adjusted to the light. And with that, everyone began to dig into their meal. They talked about the events of the week that had passed. Gary shared some of the pieces that his brass band would play. Warren talked about a new project he'd started at school, and Stan offered to take one of the brothers to work so that they could make some extra money. Gary had helped his dad before, though he respectfully declined the offer. It wasn't that Gary thought it was terrible or anything. He just could only do it for a day before he got tired and bored and needed to go home. After everybody devoured their breakfast, all 3 boys got ready and headed out for the day. "Don't do anything stupid," Kathleen called after them. "Okay, Mom," called back all 3 boys in unison. Though their mom was a soft and loving lady, she was not the type to have any sympathy for somebody who did something stupid. It may have been tough love, but it worked. The boys' first stop was the school. They hastily crossed the street to the playground, while several boys were already involved in a competitive game of ball hockey. The boys all grabbed sticks and joined in.
My mom would just open the door and send us out to play. And that was pretty typical in our, I would say, everybody's neighborhood in Toronto at that time. We'd play hockey all morning, or we played games like Relieval and I don't know what the other games were.
They played long and hard, and over the course of the morning, more and more kids joined in until they all almost had too many kids for each team. Towards 12 o'clock, kids started to filter out and go eat lunch. Gary, Keith, and Warren did the same. As their mom filled their bowls with heaping spoonfuls of warm tomato soup, the boys were itching to return to the outdoors. Gary was the first to finish his soup, and he quickly went to the door and waited for his other brothers. Shortly, they finished too, and once again they headed out. This time they walked toward the train tracks. At most times of the day, there would be steam engines moving their way along the tracks, climbing up a steep hill where Gary and his friends would meet. When Gary and his brothers arrived, they were greeted by some of their friends, but they didn't waste much time socializing. Quickly, they all started running towards a steam engine that was pulling through at that very moment. Gary led the pack of children since he was small and quick on his feet. Since the steam engines would have to slow down so they could build up steam to climb the steep hill ahead, the children were always able to jump on to the steps of the train that ran along the back, and that's exactly what these kids did.
Back in the days when I was young, the trains were steam engines. Steam engines don't just pull away really quickly. They take a long, not a long time, but a fairly long time and to build up steam. And it was going uphill. And we used to hop the trains, what we called hop the trains. We would, as the train went by, it wasn't going very quickly, we would climb onto the trains, not get into the boxcars, but just there's steps on the ends of the train, and we would climb up and ride them for, I don't know, 4 or 5 miles, and then before the trains build up a lot of steam, a lot of speed, we'd hop off and either walk home or wait for the next train coming back the other way.
Though their parents might not have been completely okay with it, they did it anyways. They took the steam engine all the way to a clearing about a mile away from where they originally jumped on. Simultaneously, every kid hopped off and headed towards the clearing. Once everybody arrived, they started to play, and play, and play. They played whatever they wanted: tag, catch the flag, or even make-believe. The imagination was limitless. That was, of course, until Gary had brass band practice at 8 o'clock sharp. "We better head home," said Keith as he checked his watch during an intense game of Red Rover. Keith was right. Gary had brass band practice soon, and his mom never liked to send him off to a practice on an empty stomach. So all 3 boys hastily headed home. This time, since there was no train to hop, they ran. They made it home in time to be able to smell the lamb chops grilled to perfection that their mom was setting out for them. All the boys hustled into the house and sat down at the table where their parents were waiting for them. After saying their grace, Gary filled his stomach with lamb chop in preparation for the long band practice that lay ahead. Once everybody had finished their dinner and cleared the table, Gary was out the door and off to his practice. The easiest and quickest way to get to Gary's band practice in downtown Toronto was on one of the trams, and that was exactly what Gary did. It wasn't as dangerous as hopping one of the moving steam engines, and it got Gary exactly where he needed to be. From the moment Gary got into band practice till the moment the hour and a half ended, he would play the cornet. Gary was exceptional at the cornet, and his teacher thought so too. The band practice that particular night flew by, and Gary was packing up his instrument and leaving, but the fun didn't end there. Gary met up with his friends as they were leaving the practice, and they all headed down to the car dealership. None of them had their eyes on a hot new ride, but what they did have their eyes on was a television. Not a TV for sale, but one that was propped up facing out the glass of the dealership window. This fancy mechanism of moving pictures was not something that any of the boys had access to in their own homes, and lucky for them, Saturday was fight night.
The screen wasn't any bigger than that, and it was black and white, and we'd sometimes all go over there in an evening and watch this TV, and the TV would be quite snowy because there wasn't cable, and you would try and get the signal in from Buffalo because there weren't any TV in Toronto. So that's the way TV started, and it wasn't. You guys don't know how much change has happened in that time. There were no computers. There were no phones that you could walk around and stick in your ear. That was pretty primitive.
The group of band students watched the fight until one of them checked their watch a little too late, and they all realized that their parents might be wondering where they were. They all caught a tram and took it to their respective homes. Gary arrived home at 10:30. He opened the door only to find his mother waiting for him with a glass of warm milk cupped in her hands. She passed the glass of milk to Gary, kissed him on the forehead, and whispered in his ear, "I love you." Then she sent him off to bed. Gary drank his warm milk and quickly fell asleep, barely being able to wait for the exciting adventures that awaited him in the next day.